last week we looked at it a lot from just a network point of view. I want to start this week by looking at it from why won't that change? Good. A signal flow point of view, and actually talk a little bit about what we're doing with it, because yes, networks are important, but ultimately we need to get audio from A to B from what we're doing. So I thought I'd start out by drawing out the typical signal flow that we are doing at the moment on soundscape shows between the console and the amplifiers. So the number in brackets in every place is how many audio channels are flowing down that particular connection. So think of them as a multi-core, 32 channel, 64 channel multi-cores. And each of those, we're not actually physically representing on this page the physical connections. This is about signal flow, because with Dante, all the channels go on a network and it doesn't matter where the devices are. And then you do the signal flow in a central patch, and it says route from A to B. This is actually looking at signal flow. So for those that haven't done soundscape shows, quickly going to work through this. So in the top, I've started with the Avid engine. That only does at the moment, they don't support large format Dante interfaces. The maximum is 16 by 16 and goes in 16 in, 16 out on a card in a stage rack, which isn't particularly useful. So we're having to come out of the console using MADI. And for those also familiar with the console, we are forced to use MADI at 96K. And quick reminder back to the very, very, very first class, when MADI is at 96K and each cable can only carry 32 channels. However, most implementations provide two sockets at that point, one for the channels 1 to 32, one for channels 33 to 64. And they should really be treated as one link, one connection. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. So first of all, we start off MADI coming out the engines, two 32 channel MADI streams. And then we need to do two jobs. We need to get them onto the Dante network, and we need to convert them to 48K. And the reason we have to get down to 48K is because Soundscape only runs at 48K. Huge discussions back and forth in the very early days of us trying to use Soundscape of why such limitation, given we had recently been enjoying AES from the console to amplifiers at 96K. But that's a different conversation for a different day. So Yamaha make a product called RMIO 64Ds, whose one main job is to convert between MADI and Dante. They also have the feature that they can do sample rate conversion. So for us, it ends up as a one-stop solution. So each MADI stream, they can only handle one MADI stream though, which is 32 channels. So whilst from a Dante perspective, they could handle 64 channels in and out, that 64 channels in and out is at 48K. Because they only have one MADI stream in each, and we're working at 96K on our MADI, each device can only handle 32 channels on and off the Dante network. So we need, just for Soundscape, which Soundscape is a 64 input system, we need two 32 channel MADI streams at 96K, two RMIO 64Ds. So far, so good. Because we're always paranoid on shows and we try to build in redundancies, certainly for things that are central to the whole rig, we like to have two DS100s, both mirroring each other, doing the same job. So we actually do a digital split in Dante world at this point. So we patch each RMIO's 32 channels into both DS100s. So they both receive the same set of 64 channels overall. Yeah, everyone good with that? Then we come out of the 64 outputs from each DS100, go into a Dante switch, whose job is to take 64 from device A, 64 from device B, and then output the chosen 64 channels of audio. This is all happening in Dante world now, the actual physical patching. And then the flow from there is we patch different Dante output numbers from the switcher. So we switched outputs 1 to 64, and we'll patch those to different DS10s located by the amplifiers, which will convert it back to AES again into the actual amps. Everything prior to the X Dante is a bit of a one-to-one patch. You know, it's blocks of 32 channels being patched. Outputs of the X Dante to the DS10s are not necessarily one-to-one. We might have channel 1 from Soundscape is a left speaker, channel 2 might be a right speaker, and they could be in completely different amp rooms. So we're not necessarily patching one-to-one, but that's roughly the signal flow. Everyone okay with that? Great. I've probably said an awful lot of things on this page, but sort of breaking it down now, I think I've talked about the MADI streams. Just a little note for some people, certainly on the more recent implementations of our shows, but on the MADI side, between the console and the RMIO 64Ds, we're now sticking MADI routers between the two. Again, this is not really for this particular discussion, but the main reason for that is technically when you link multiple MADIs, two MADI streams that are acting as one, so two 96K streams act as one stream of 64, you should only connect them between the same two devices. Because we're having to connect them between two different devices, there is a problem when we're doing audio in the other direction, that the two MADI messages aren't perfectly synchronized. And the Avid gets very upset very quickly about that. So by putting a MADI router in between, we're getting around that problem. But most of the work in the MADI router is one-to-one. But just, it's not really for today, but that's something that I've missed off on this drawing for people to say. Going back to this concept of it, the difference between signal flow and location, I've left the signal flow on this drawing, but color-coded to where we might be putting the physical equipment. We no longer have to put the equipment sensible for signal flow. So quite often now, and I think Starlight is an exception, we would put all the DS100s, the Avid engine, and the RMIO 64Ds all in the substage, all in an amp room or in the basement out the way, so don't need that equipment at front of house. And the only device really for the Dante world at front of house would be the switcher, the changeover switcher. But because it's all network-based, it doesn't matter. And then in the amp rooms, we'd have the DS10s on the Dante network. So the physical locations don't have to match the signal flow. For our Starlight colleagues on here, the reason why on Starlight, there was a couple of reasons on Starlight why we didn't split these off into different rooms. One, we actually had a really big front of house position, we didn't need to. And two, we were interfacing to lots of legacy things that all came from front of house. So we kept all the equipment there as one central distribution. We nowadays, we're certainly not doing that. However, if we now look at it from a network connection point of view, this is more the story for that same signal flow. So in the substage, this is only showing one of the two networks. This is just saying primary. Secondary would just be a duplicate. So if we look at it from the substage point of view, all of those 4 Dante devices would connect to the Dante primary switch. That switch would then connect to switches in other locations, and then all of the Dante devices in those locations would connect to that switch. So the point looking at here is that the signal flow, very different to the network, physical network. Just a little talk. I'm sorry I couldn't get a better res photo of the back of X-Dante 1. Believe it or not, on Autograph's website, it was tiny. Just want a quick talk about X-Dante 1 switches, because I think there's some, it can be quite confusing. So on the back here, can people see the mouse? I don't know if that shows up. Yeah, good. 2 IECs, but we know what they are. Another 2 Cat5 sockets, sorry, RJ45 sockets, to be precise, which are for remote controls, nothing to do with network whatsoever. But then there are 2 boxes, and effectively, an X-Dante switch is 2 32-channel changeovers in a box. They're effectively 2 independent switches, which you can control individually at the top. Now, there's one button that will control both. It is sort of all written on this slide, but anyone think of why they have done it as 2 devices in a box, not just one big switch?
Limitation of Brooklyn chip.
Exactly that. So the Dante Brooklyn card, which is the most common card, can only support 64 channels in and 64 channels out. In a 64 audio channel changeover box, going in and out of that box, there actually is 128 channels going in, 2 sets of 64, and 64 coming out. You cannot put 128 channels of audio into a Brooklyn board, into a Dante board. So actually, in quite a smart solution, what Autograph decided to do was say, well, hold on, then we'll just put 2 different Brooklyn cards in the box. So that's why we have a duplicate set of connectors. So this is primary and secondary on Brooklyn card 1, which handles changeover of the first 32 channels. And this is primary and secondary on Brooklyn card 2, which handles the second set of Dante channels. And this leads to some interesting patching when you're coming to patch them up. So I thought it was worth talking through. So inside the box, we have 2 Brooklyn cards. The first Brooklyn card takes 32 channels in from our device A. It takes 32 channels in from our device B. That's its 64 inputs full. And it outputs the chosen device to the first 32 outputs it can do. So what that means is the first 32 Dante inputs to this Brooklyn card, you patch to device A. But the first 32 inputs from device B, you patch to 33 through 60, inputs 33 to 64 of that Brooklyn card. It just needs a little bit of thinking. And then the same happens for the second Brooklyn card. So actually looking at it in a little bit more detail with our two DS100s feeding these, the two Brooklyn cards are both inside this box. This is now looking at it as signal flow again. So as I just said, coming out of this DS100, the first 32 outputs we patch to the first 32 inputs of this, the first device in here. And then, because we're going to switch the other 32 channels, we take the first 32 channels from DS100B, and we go into inputs 33 to 64. It then chooses between the two, and then outputs 1 to 32 come out. So that outputs 1 to 32 come from whichever DS100's first set of channels, 1 to 32. Then looking at the second half of the stream, the first DS100 outputs 33 to 64. We patch into inputs 1 to 32 of the second card. And then DS100B, we take its 33 to 64 and patch that into 33 to 64. And then outputs 1 to 32 of this switch are the chosen channels of 33 to 64. It's a little confusing, but have I explained that okay? There. Feel free to ask any questions. If everyone's cool with that, I'll move on. It's just something to know when you're looking at patching. So we've looked at this from a signal flow point of view. How do we achieve something? So I thought I'd step through a couple of parts of the patching. As we've already said last week, first thing you need to do is make sure all devices are named, Dante named, so you can recognize what they are, and set correctly for redundancy and sample rate. As we've just looked at, each ex-Dante 1 switch that we think of as one switch will appear as 2 Dante devices. The default naming of those does indicate which device is handling the first 32 channels and which device is handling the second 32 channels. I can't remember what the default name is, unfortunately, so we'll put that in. Once you've named all the devices to something that makes sense to us, then you can start to patch. Most of this patching is one-to-one, and the 32 channel blocks are nice and quick. A lot quicker than if you had to do it by hand. Going back to the ex-Dante 1, it is important to name both parts of the switch in a way you can recognize. Quite often on shows, we will have at least 2 ex-Dante 1s in service, one handling QLab playback changeover and one handling soundscape changeover. So effectively, the 2 ex-Dante 1s are creating 4 devices on the network. So it's important we name them, that we know it's the QLab switch and it's first half of the QLab switch and QLab switch second half. So, we're going to look at patching from this RMIO 64D to this DS100. So we're just looking at this 32 channels here on the blue link. So in Dante controller, along the top we have all the transmitters, and on the left we have all of the receivers. So in this case, we want to transmit from this RMIO 64D to this DS100. These are now the names that I've given these devices in Dante. So in Dante controller, along the top, we would expand RMIO 64D1 and see all of its channels of transmitter. And on the left, we would expand DS100A, and then we would just patch, ticking those little cross points. RMIO 64D unit 1, output 1 to DS100A, input 1, etc. For the first 32 channels, because it's only outputs 32. So in Dante controller, up the top here, RMIO 64D1, there's all of its output channels. And then on the left, I've expanded DS100A, that's all of its inputs. And it is a one-to-one patch, and you literally click slowly along this line, one-to-one. That makes sense. We can only do 32 because each RMIO is only giving us 32 channels out that we can use. It does actually go on to 64, which you would get if you have Imadi at 48K, but we're not. So only 32 are useful. Yeah, there's a few people looking at that slide, so I'll just hold a second. Cool. So now we'd move on to patch all the channels in this stream. So this is part of the digital split. So along the top, we'd still be looking at RMIO 64D1. But now we'll change this and we'll collapse that there, and we'll expand DS100B. And we'll make the same patches. We're actually now splitting. So now that's created a split. The same outputs are going to two different destinations at the same time. That's perfectly fine. Uses up more flows, but we're okay because we're only doing a limited number of destinations. Now we'd carry on and we'd look at the signal flow along this line. So now along the top, we'd be looking at RMO 64D Unit 2. And we'd expand DS100A on the left again. But now we're patching output 1 of this unit into input 33 of the soundscape. And we make all those patches. And I've skipped it, but we'd repeat the same for this last leg down here, which is RMO 64D2 into DS100B. Everyone okay with that part of the signal flow? How you do in the patch? And big thumbs up from Ramon. Everyone's okay? Great. So now let's look at this next part of our signal chain. So we're going from our two outputs from our two DS100s into the changeover switch. Now, as we've already discussed, the changeover switch actually has two devices in the box. So I've named it, I like to keep the name of the type of device. I think that helps people find things. This is an ex-Dante switch. It's doing DS100 switching, and it's the first half of it and the second half of it. You could do A or B, whatever. I think we normally do A or B, to be fair. But I wanted to differentiate from DS100 A and B. And so remember, it's two devices, each changing between two sets of 32 inputs. So if we look at this stream here, now 64 channels flowing from the DS100 into the switch. So in Dante controller, along the top, we'd expand DS100A as outputs. And then on the left, we'd expand the first Dante device in this box, ex-Dante DS101. And then we'd make the patch, DS100A output 1 into input 1 of the first switch, 2 to 2, and then working all the way through to 31 to 31, 32 to 32. So that's patched half of the channels out of this device. So then on the left, the receivers, we would change, so we're now looking at the second switch in this box. And then we would continue making patches from DS100. So we'd go its output 33 into input 1 of the second switch, 2 all the way up to 32. So we would now have patched all of those inputs. And looking at the other part of the flow, we are DS100B along the top, first switch on the right, but now we're patching into the second half of channels of that switch. So from DS100B, output 1 would go into input 33 of the first half of the switch, all the way up to 64. And then finally, we'd look at the second part of this switch, and we'd do DS100B outputs 33, 33, 34, 34. And that's listed out what we talked about. Hopefully haven't confused anyone along that step of the way. Then looking at the last part of the signal chain, this is where we're patching. It's good to think of it at this point, although we're patching from the switch outputs, from a signal flow point of view, we're effectively patching the soundscape output. So it's just changing between the two units. So actually we're patching soundscape output 1, soundscape output 2, all the way up to 64 to different amplifier channels. Now this is where you don't find these nice long diagonal runs where it's one-to-one patch. Because quite often we split our amplifiers to house left and house right, and that means that and often within soundscape we do left right as adjacent channels, so you end up with them being split. So it's quite normal to end up with patch that looks like that from switch output to DS10s. Just looking at that in slightly more detail, say we had 5 arrays, they might be in an amp room, separate grid amp room, and they'd have DS10 unit 1, and they'd be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then front fills might be split left and right. So you can work through that chart later. You make the patch as needed by the designer, you follow the audio flow. Just a brief word on channel counts and bandwidth on the network. Whilst we don't have to worry too much, whilst the signal flow, let's get to the signal flow. Back to long way back. Here, we're looking at it from a perspective of if we were cabling this by physical cables, one for each wire, 16-way multi-cores, 32 multi-cores. Because we've put the devices in different locations, actual audio traffic is still flowing in signal flow, but not in the same way. What do I mean by that? Well, on this particular network link, there are 64 channels going into the device and 64 channels coming back out. So that's using bandwidth each way of 64 channels. On this, same with DS100B. On the RMIOs in this example, where there's no input back to the console, so we're just in outputs from the console, so there's no Dante inputs data being used, but we're using 32 channels back out. Same here. And if we look at between our switch, then if we look between switches, it is still following the signal flow. So these 32 channels coming out of this RMIO, all those packets will go to this switch, and they know that their destination is the two DS100s. So they will flow like that. The packets, the switch will forward the packets by IP routing. Then the outputs of these two DS100s need to go to the ex-Dante switch, which may be at front of house. So on this trunk cable between the two physical locations, we've got 64 channels from this DS100, 64 channels this 100, all wanting to go to front of house. So they're using 128 channels worth of bandwidth on this one network link. Then back at this end, because the ex-Dante device has two Dante devices in it, it has two network links, the primary, two network links, secondary. So these 128 channels arrive at this switch, and then they're sent to each switch, each half of the switch, so only 64 in and 64 in. Now you might think that because each half of the switch is only generating 32 outputs, that we would only have a maximum of 32 outputs coming out of each switch. But that's not the case. So if I look here, we might be patching one output to more than one DS10. We might be doing another further digital split if you think about some outfills. We've run out of output, so we only have a left-right output from Soundscape for outfills, but we might have 3 levels of outfills, so we might be feeding 3 sets of amplifiers. Now, we maybe would do this in AES, but if we were doing it all using Dante and digital, Dante patching, we would be double patching it. And because of in unicast messaging, that means there's more flows. There's a flow set to each destination. So actually more channels of bandwidth can be created if we're doing digital splits. And so in this case, I haven't gone into the details, but I've said that all 16 inputs to this DS10 are being used, all 16 to this, only 14 on this, 16 and 16. So on this link, we're using 16 plus 16 plus 14, which is 46, I hope. And on this link, we're using 32. So actually leaving front of house, there is a total of 78 channels worth of audio. Now, we don't have to, this is laboring it a little bit. And this is only reason this is a thing to even consider is down to bandwidth. So we have to ensure, and it's normally only the trunks, we have to ensure that the trunks aren't overloaded. And once you start approaching 400 channels in each direction on a particular network link, you maybe need to stop and think about bandwidth at 48K.
Russell, are we taking for granted that this is only half of what we're looking at the Dante network?
As in it's only the primary, not the secondary?
Correct, sir.
Yes, it is. As I said down the bottom, I didn't labour that point. Thank you for bringing it up. Everything in Dante is duplicated. So everything going on the primary network should be going on the secondary network in the same way. Just we duplicate the wiring. Everything is twice. A switch for each in each location. So actual channel count would be the same on primary and secondary at all points.
So, Russ, are we also saying that we're best off, whereas in the past we used to sort of put spare cabling and spare patch in, actually not patching anything in spare whatsoever to keep the channel counts low on the trunk?
To be honest with
And
you,
then
Mike,
patch when you need
to be honest with you, I've laboured the point, but I have yet on a trunk to get over 450 channels.
Right, so you reckon it's around 450 channels and then it will start falling
The
over?
theoretical limit on a decent 1 gigabit link is 512, but they, because of jitter and other reasons, they never recommend going over about 80% capacity.
Right, okay, fair enough.
But I have yet to get a channel count over 450. And this is again on a 1 gigabit link. So I know I haven't recently, but I know Dom, Andy, and Matt have been doing fibre links between front of house and stage at 10G. And that then your channel count goes up.
Yeah, then it's fine.
Like massively. It's only really when you're doing 1 gigabit. And I just tend to do, when I'm designing the network flow, I just tend to pigeon scratch my trunk links just to make sure I'm not close and haven't made a silly mistake questioning bandwidth. But that's the whole reason to do a quick think about it. So everything we just looked at is just one part of our Dante network. On most shows, I think people will also know that we use DVS for QLab computers, Dante Virtual Sound Card, or lately I think we're using RME digifaces, but they're still generating Dante outputs from the computer one way or the other. If we're doing that, the signal flow would be from the DVS of the computer or from the Dante digiface to the RMIO 64D inputs. They would then convert this back to MADI and upsample convert to 96K. So that's the signal flow at that point. I think most people are used to the fact that whilst in this example, we've only had 2 RMIO 64Ds, on a lot of shows, we've got 3 or 4 in use. And that's because once we've decided to do all of the front of house PA using Dante, it's pointless not doing all of the fallback and the other ancillary outputs over Dante. So at which point we need another stream of channels out of the console onto the Dante network to feed all our fallback. So quite often there'll be a third RMIO 64D or even a fourth that doesn't go via the Dante switch. They would come straight from the RMIOs and patch-wise would go straight out to the DS10 channels, feeding our fallback. Lately, I've done a couple of shows, and I'm sure many others have, where keyboard guys and Ableton people, Ableton Play band playback, are getting into using MADI, Dante, or MADI, but in our case, it's quite handy to go Dante if we already got a Dante network. Gives us a nice high channel count for those computers, so they're additional inputs onto our Dante network, and to get them into the S6L, we go via RMO 64Ds again. So we just continue the patch. And I think lately a couple of us have even used Dante cards inside Allen Heath DM64s, which we tend to use as our monitor desks for bands. Again, very useful if we've got Ableton playback sources that we need to split between the front of house desk and the monitor desk. Put a Dante card in the Allen Heath, and also then we can do our returns from front of house to the Allen Heath. So there are many other Dante channels that we haven't looked at in detail, but we tend to have on our shows. Anyone got anything specific, if they've got anything about their own shows or on that sort of stuff? I think that's cool. So what daily living with Dante? No one is ever going to start analysing network packets to do with Dante. That's not what we're here for. And Dante Controller does actually give us quite a bit of information, but there's a couple of caveats to that. Dante Controller can only list problems or faults that it discovers that occur whilst it is running. The individual Dante devices do not have an internal log. So if they lose clock and then re-establish clock or something happens, unless Dante Controller is running, other than what you heard with your ears, there is no evidence to that event occurring. I'm very mixed on this, but I tend to suggest to people, certainly during production process, that you leave Dante controller running at all times, so that it catches any clocking issues or any events on the Dante network. If it's not running, there's no evidence that it happened. There's no logs that it can download from each device. So certainly during production, I think it's a very good idea to keep Dante controller running. I sort of said it last week. I have had experiences where if Dante controller can only talk onto one of the two networks, so either primary or secondary, it can miss some events. It doesn't actually log all the faults. There are several fault conditions that can occur. So I always ensure that both primary and secondary networks get into my system one computer where Dante controller is running, so that it can monitor both parts of the network. Now, having said that, I've had it where people have been scared. When you cold start your rig, so up from being turned off, if you ran Dante controller before many of the devices on the network have started, you will see many events generated that are flagged as errors and warnings. And this is actually perfectly normal. The Dante network will always try and make sure a device on the network acts as the clock master. Now, it has an election system for this, as we sort of discussed briefly last week, and we can choose within Dante controller devices that we prefer to be the master. So what happens, as you power on the rig, different devices take a different amount of time to boot. So it's quite normal that the device that you want to be clock master, you've told is the preferred master, might not be the first device to boot on the Dante network. And that will mean another device starts life as clock master and stays there until your preferred device comes along, at which point the network will change clocking to your preferred device. This will generate log entry because it's classed as a change of clock. Absolutely fine. So in Dante controller, bottom right, we'll look at it in a second, there are a couple of status LED symbols for clock and other events. Almost certainly, if you run Dante controller before or during your rig powering up, these will go red. And you'll need to clear the logs. Once you've cleared the logs and any clock messages, they stay green until another fault occurs. And that's when Dante controller is useful to us on a daily run. So here is a view of Dante controller again. Bottom left in this screenshot, I've only got primary network connected, which is not recommended, but in my mashup of Dante network that I've set up at home to do these screenshots, that's all I could achieve. But they should both be green if we've done our jobs correctly. We looked at it last week, but we've got hazard symbols here on both these devices. And what that is telling us is that some of the channels that this device wants to receive audio from, it cannot see that device. Now, on a daily running show, you should never see a hazard symbol there. If you do, it almost certainly means that something on the network is turned off, either transmitting device is physically not on, or a network switch is off, or something like that. The reason in my example these are hazard symbols is because I've renamed the devices so many times that the patches it's expecting to see, the device is no longer called the same name, so it couldn't re-establish the patch. Now, what we're actually talking about at the moment are these two bits down here, bottom right. You've got the event log and the clock status monitor. And in this, I ran Dante controller before I booted either of these devices, and it generated events, as I said it might well do on startup. So let's have a look at them. If you click on these, you go straight to the menus. You can also access them through view. So let's look at, I think it's clock status monitor first. So the log is written that the latest entry is at the top. So the first event that happened was, I'm on my Mac, I was running DVS, Dante Virtual Sound Card, and when it started, sent out a message, an error message saying, clock sync unlocked, I have not got a clock. Now, why did it not master clock on its own? Dante Virtual Sound Card cannot be the master clock. So it's saying, no, there's no clock, I can't work. 7 seconds later, it says, oh, I now have a good clock and everything's okay. And that's because at that point, the DS100 finished booting So it now changed its clock and went, yep, I'm now happy. So there was no actual fault. It was just due to the order of things booting. By now having opened this window, the green LED status would now go green. There's no problems. You can also save these events out. If you ever need tech support to help you or any of us, this is quite, and there's a Dante problem going on, knowing where you can save these logs, very helpful to us. They could well help us. So this is how you can save the clock log from this window. So this is now opening the events window. You can get to this from a couple of places, but clicking on the LED by the events on the bottom right will get you here quickly. Again, the latest entries are at the top. And all of these entries are generated by starting up and problems on startup. So looking at this in order, my Mac has gone resolution failed. Basically means it can't connect to anything of clock or its audio channels. Next event that occurred on the network was the DS100, which I haven't renamed as its default name, has been elevated to Grandmaster, i.e. it has become the main clock on the network. My local DVS then goes, oh, the clocking system's changed, so it will unlock and then it will lock to the new master. All of this is startup and perfectly normal. Once I've opened this window, I've now cleared the status. That light will now go green. Once you've done that, once you've cleared anything from after startup, if they change to red and there's events generated, it doesn't always mean there's a major problem, but it's certainly good to look at, and definitely during production. That all helpful for people? Basics of grabbing that. Just wanted to do a quick word on Dante firmware. A few of us learned the hard way very early on when Dante came in about some of these steps. And we're indeed on site banging our heads on walls where we hadn't observed all these things. In general, I suspect most people on here wouldn't be doing firmware upgrade, and I would always recommend getting the shops to do it. However, it's good to be aware of situations where it can go wrong, because you can look into this information and be aware that it can exist. Even though most devices have the same Brooklyn 2 board inside them, we talked about last week that Audiante keep close holds of the same board in every device, certainly the same electronics and firmware. Actually, manufacturer to manufacturer, the process of doing firmware update can be different, and it's worth remembering that. Equally, the actual Dante firmware, so the firmware that runs on the Brooklyn 2 card, can vary between manufacturers. So just because you've downloaded from Audiante's website the latest Dante firmware for a Brooklyn 2 card, applying it to all products, it can go wrong. And that's because there's a couple of settings that on the TDM, the actual, how the card communicates to the internal actual real audio device varies. The messages vary, and that's configured per package. So strong recommendation to always use the firmware package from individual manufacturers for the specific product. The sequence in which you do the firmware update can also vary between manufacturers and products. Again, if you're involved in it, read. Quite often, this is what caught a lot of people out in early days of Dante. Effectively, for the first time in a while, there were two firmwares associated with a physical piece of hardware, so say a CL5. You had the firmware that the CL5 was running, so Yamaha had written, and you had the firmware that the Dante card was running. And you have to update them separately. I think that's changed recently, that you can now do everything at once. But there's still a lot of products out there where you have to do the physical manufacturer's update as well as the Dante update. And it's really important that you do the right versions that match for the firmware version of the product as well as the Dante firmware version. Nearly all manufacturers have charts on this. I've laboured this quite a lot, but you can end up with some really bizarre faults where some audio won't route, some audio doesn't come out. It can be a very bizarre world. And if you're trying to fault find this, Dante Controller will always tell you which firmware version each Dante device is running in the device list. And the product itself will definitely tell you what firmware it's running, so Yamaha CL5 zone version. And quite often, I look at the two numbers and going to the manufacturer's website and looking for the latest numbers and comparing and making sure the two that should be associated will solve 3/4 of your problems. So what I've tried to do throughout this course is give helpful tips on replacing devices, because ultimately that's mostly what people are going to be doing. I touched a little bit on it last week, but I was going to go into a bit more detail this week. We've talked about that for every Dante device, it has transmit and receive channels. And that the Dante receive channels use names to know which Dante transmit channel to connect to. So it's using the Dante name of the transmitting device to re-establish connection, therefore getting around the IP changing problem. If, say, we're replacing a DS100 and we had named the old, the Dante card in that DS100, DS100A, then in theory, you would think that on our new DS100, as long as we named the Dante card in that DS100A, everything would work. And indeed, part of it would work. Any device that received audio from the DS100 would now reconnect because it uses the Dante name. So that would all work perfectly. However, the bit that wouldn't work is this new DS100, its receive channels, so its inputs, don't know about any of the devices it was meant to be connected to on our network, our Dante network. So it would not re-establish any connections of audio into itself. Because any inputs to a Dante device are stored, the patch of them are stored within the device. So we'd end up with only half of our network connected. And if we looked in Dante controller, all the ex-Dante, in this example, the ex-Dante switch would be saying, everything's great, I've got all my inputs. But the RMA064, this particular DS100 would show no input patches. So fortunately, yes, so that's what I've just said. So in this example, the DS10s would, if this is now looking at changing the ex-Dante switch out. If we put a new ex-Dante switch in and named both Dante devices in it the same as the old one, all the DS10s would be able to re-establish their connections, but the inputs to this ex-Dante would not be re-established. So fortunately, there's a thing called Dante presets that fixes this. It's a bit like WSM's receiver match, but works a lot better, unsurprisingly. In a Dante preset, it's a file we can save out of Dante controller, and you can save as little or as much information in each file as you would like. You can save information about one device, two devices, or all the devices on the network. And you can choose to save just the patch or all the config options, the naming, etc., etc. And the Dante controller enables a preset to be reloaded intelligently to a Dante system. So what do I mean by that? Well, we'll stick with our example of swapping an ex-Dante switch. And the broken ex-Dante switch, we've named the two Dante devices within ex-Dante DS100-1, ex-Dante DS100-2. Now, our spare Dante switch may have default names of ex-Dante-A and ex-Dante-B, so the names don't match. When you reload a Dante preset, Dante controller, so if we had just swapped these two devices, so we've taken the old one out, put the new one in, when we reran Dante controller and opened our preset that we had saved during production like good people, Dante controller will notice that two ex-Dante devices are missing because it cannot find their names. It's expected to find on the network ex-Dante DS101, ex-Dante DS102. However, it will also notice that there are two new ex-Dante devices present that it hadn't stored before. And it offers you to load the settings from the old Dante switch into the new one, matching the old device to the new device. And it can rename, so then that'll fix the output patch we already talked about, but it will also repatch all of the inputs. And it will also set all the redundancy and sampling rates. So this makes swapping devices much simpler. On a typical GOS show, it's likely that you will have two Dante configuration files in your system. It's likely one of them will be on your sister computer, whichever system computer we've installed Dante controller on, and the other one will be on your radio computer. And that's because in general on our shows, we keep the Dante network doing wave tool monitoring separate from the rest of the Dante network running the rest of the whole system. So effectively, we have 2 Dante implementations on our shows. So we therefore have 2 different presets. This is in general. I don't think any of us have not done that. I think that's pretty much what we've been doing. So if we were replacing the next Dante switch at front of house, we'd remove the old one, noting the connections of primary and secondary, because it will have 2 primary connections and 2 secondary connections, and we mustn't cross the networks. Certainly if we've prepped out of stage sound services, I think all of us are patching using the different color patch cables, which are not by length. There's multiple lengths of different colors, so we use one color for primary, one color for secondary. In the American shops, it varies hugely what we have, but certainly out of a couple of them, the color means length of cable. So the colors will almost certainly all be the same on all 4 of these cables. So note which ones come from where. They should be labeled, but if they haven't been, no. Also note on the back of the X-Dantes, there's a couple of push buttons that control the remote control options. Note those. We'll put the new device in, but, and this is the same as we've talked about with all Dante stuff, only connect the 2 primary networks. Do not connect the 2 secondary networks. And that's because if for some bizarre reason the last user of this switch had it configured for daisy chain, then plugging in primary and secondary will link the 2 networks together, and you won't be able to load presets, and the whole Dante network will fall to pieces. So it's very, very important to only plug primary networks in until you're sure that the Dante devices are set for redundancy mode. Then once we've connected just the primaries, we would go to Dante controller, we'd load the preset. It would show us that it's found a new device and it's lost this device. Do we want to match them? We do it. Then we can go back and plug in the secondary networks, because once it's loaded the preset file, it will have switched them into redundancy mode, definitely. Next step is we should go back to Dante controller, and in the device list, make sure for that X-Dante switcher that both primary and secondary are good, that the IP addresses are listed correctly, so we know we've got the right round. And then the bit that is all too easy to forget, actually check audio passes. Just actually looking at that from a Dante controller point of view, up on the top bar, you have a little folder icon, which is load, and a little star icon, which is save. So we go to the open folder icon. You then have to choose a file. If we've been good, it should be in the show folder and in a folder called Dante, and it's the extension of the file is .xml. So an example might be diana.dante.xml. And then this window appears. Now there's quite a lot of options on here, and don't be worried about it. We want everything from this first column. This is where you can choose which parameters you're going to push to the network. We want to do all of them, certainly if we're replacing. These are the different roles that it knew existed before. And these are the devices it can find. Now, it's saying that RustMac, it's found a device called RustMac, so it will push those 2 together. That makes sense. Now, in this particular example, I've replaced this DS100. So in the file, the DS100 was called 0810 EC, and on the network, it's now called 0910 AB. And it's already gone, oh, well, this is a replacement. So it's saying I'm going to push the settings that were in that name to what I'm finding as this name. Now, these are both highlighted blue, and if I clicked OK, it would update information on both of those. And in theory, it wouldn't change anything on my device. However, what did I just do? However, I would just select the device you're replacing. So it would only be this line that would be highlighted blue. And then it would force the settings to that device and would indeed change its name back, etc. And that's the end of the process. It's actually very, very straightforward. Is that all cool with everyone? Looking around, great. If for whatever reason it can't work out what the replacement is, it lists reasons here. I couldn't actually make it go wrong, so I couldn't generate any events here. Normally, it would only list problems here if firmwares don't match, as a couple other reasons. But at that point, it gives you options to what can we do. But if this column is empty and these green dots are green and you can see the replacements, all is good. And just labouring the point. If you were changing an ex-Dante switch, you'd be replacing 2 devices here. There's 2 Dante devices in the box. From a save point of view, which in theory should be done by one of us before we leave you on your running shows, it's you click on the star, you then click which devices you want to save, and then you click which parameters you want to save. Now, excuse me, we should save all devices apart from any spares. So it varies massively whether we put the spares on the network or not. I tend not to, because not really much point. There is an argument though, if the spare's on the network already, then in the middle of if you had to do it during rig check, you don't have to do any plugging at all. You could just unplug power to your old device, and then you'd want to force the preset to the spare. If you've stored the spare in your system preset file, Dante Controller doesn't think of it as a spare device, a new device that appears. So the automatic, I found a new device, do you want me to apply the settings for the missing device, do not work. And all of this process does not work. So it's important if we have got on-network spares, which there's some advantages to, it's really, really important on the left here when we save, not to include them in the file. Because then when we load them, Dante Controller will think they're new devices and will offer you to match with the missing devices. All cool? Great. You can use exactly the same process on the radio Dante network. So if you were replacing a radio receiver, so a 6000 receiver or an Axient receiver, you could do exactly the same thing. But one word of caution at this point, this process is only about making the Dante side of the device work again. It will not fix any other parameters that you need. So in a radio receiver, it won't set the IP on the control network. It won't set the receiver name. It won't set the frequencies. It's just about the Dante at this point. Effectively, you have to do things twice, different things, different times. However, from a Dante point of view, this Dante presets will simplify it. Exactly the same process we've just done. Change the file, it will see a new receiver, patch it through. Just mostly on our shows, our radio receivers, some of them only have primary, but even the devices have primary and secondary networks. We tend to only patch up one of the 2 networks. We don't really worry about redundancy at that point. Just a word of caution on Yamaha devices with this process. So because Yamaha have tried to make things very easy, as in actually if you're trying to use a CL5, they've tried to make it you don't even need to use Dante Controller, and they succeeded very, very well. They, as I mentioned last week, have a rotary knob on them, which sets their name, and effectively it's like the knob's number dash Yamaha dash RMIO 64 for, no, not 64, RMIO 32 for input box. So whenever you turn that rotary knob, the Dante name of that device changes. Now you can customize that name in Dante Controller if you want. However, if you were then to turn the Dante, this rotary knob after you did that, it would reset the name again. So it's very, very important if you're swapping out Yamaha products to make sure you set the rotary knob and the dip switches. So the redundancy settings and their startup mode are all set by the dip switches on the back. There's 8 dip switches on the back. It's important that you set them to be the same before you try and do the Dante preset match. Otherwise, it won't work properly. So, last couple of points on Dante Controller. From Dante Controller, you can get a device overview, so you can see all the devices on the system. There's different columns for different things. All primary addresses, certainly on our shows, should be 169.254.something.something. All secondary addresses should be 172.31.something.something. They're the default numbers. If you see them appearing in the wrong column, you've probably got a patch error. You've got a secondary and primary the wrong way around. Dante controller may or may not warn you, but it's another really easy check to make sure that you've got the network sorted around. If there's a Dante DVS device, that will only have primary. And on our shows, it's likely that radio receivers will also only have primary addresses listed. We've talked about the bottom right, 2 clock and events that once you've cleared them after startup, they should stay green. We've talked about hazard symbols on the patch page. And just refreshing back to last week, the latency tab, if you're dealing in all the histogram bars, so how many messages at what delay over the network, what latency it's taken to get across the network, should be green. If any of those bars are red, it will mean that outside the latency window we set and there's a problem. So these are all different things we can do to help check. That's kind of the end of that part of the subject. So everyone okay there? Sort of going to stay with Dante, but just briefly back onto some network stuff now. What's the time? Not bad. So haven't really talked much about unicast or multicast. So in Dante, most people have heard of the terms unicast or multicast flows. So we discussed flows last week. They're the theoretical blocks of channels that are sent between devices. And unicast is like most messaging over a network. It's point to point. So you have a destination address, you send to that destination address, and switches using the MAC address ensure that it gets to the right end device, and data only goes to devices it's intended to. And in Dante, mostly we have unicast flows. In fact, that's the default. Unless we tell something otherwise, it will set everything up as unicast flows. So from one device to another device. If the same audio needs to go to 2 devices, it will send out 2 sets of messages, 1 to each device. I think I've said most of them. In general, in our world, we only really need unicast. However, there are good exceptions where multicast is used. A very broad stroke example is in rock and roll, when they have huge numbers of amplifiers all wanting one signal, so all wanting left and all wanting right. And at that point, a transmitting Dante device, whatever that might be, the lake or whatever is the last device before the amplifiers, would have, if it was in unicast, would have to send a message, the same data to every amplifier, which is very inefficient and uses a lot of flows. But at that point, you might say, well, we want a multicast flow. So this is sort of talking multicast as enabling us to do from one device to many. But earlier on when we were talking about networking, we were talking about unicast and broadcast messages. So multicast is kind of like a third method of sending messages. So heading back slightly towards the networking side, let's quickly look at the differences between unicast, broadcast, and multicast, because they're all methods of sending messages across a network. So in unicast, this is the one we've discussed kind of mostly throughout the whole of these 5 weeks. Data is sent from one device to another device. Now, in my very bad drawings within PowerPoint, each of these links is just one cable. So between the switches, that blue and red line is one cable. I'm just trying to show different packets of data on this drawing. So unicast is from one end device to another end device. The software running on that device uses IP addresses for the destination. We learned right back at the beginning that the network interface hardware, the actual network device, discovers the MAC address for the destination and then sends the message out. The switches learn which MAC address are connected to which physical ports, sockets, and then deliver the data only to that socket. No bandwidth is wasted, and the sender does not have to repeat data, does have to repeat data sent for each destination if it needs the same data to go to multiple places. So in this example, I've got a computer on the left, or a device on the left, it could be a Dante device, doesn't matter, that's wanting to send the same data, so if we're talking in Dante, the same audio channel, to both my other computers. So if we did this as unicast, it would have to, that sending computer, device, Dante device, would have to send the message twice, and it would send it with 2 different destination addresses. So the bandwidth between it and its switch would have twice the data, 2 audio packets. In this example, the bandwidth between switch 1 and switch 2 would have twice the data. But then the receiving devices only get the data once, And between switch B and C, the data is only moved once. And the other computers on the network don't receive anything. So this is a very efficient way to do it, unless we're sending the same message to many, many machines. Now, in this example, we're doing 1 to 2 machines, and that would still be okay unicast. If we were scaling this up, then we might have to think about it. So now if we look at the same topology and doing the same thing, we want to send the same message to 2 machines, but we're going to do it using broadcast. Now, Dante does not support broadcast messaging, so this is not a Dante thing at this point. However, unicast, broadcast, and multicast are 3 different methods of sending messages over a network. So we did touch on broadcast way back in the beginning, if anyone can remember that far. So broadcast from one end device to all other devices on the network. The job of a switch is to send a broadcast message to everything on the same VLAN or the same network, depending. The address the transmitter uses, the destination address, is the last address in the subnet. So if we were using addresses in the range 192.168.1. something, with the subnet 255.255.250, the broadcast address for that network is 1.255. Don't worry about that too much. You only have to worry about that if you're coding or doing some OSC fancinesses. All the switches will forward the message to every device in that VLAN on that subnet. It is then the software, then that message will arrive at the computer, and the network interface will go, oh, it's a broadcast message. I'm going to pass this up to the software to decide what to do. So the software in the device, the OS, has to decide whether it cares or not about that broadcast message. It has involved the CPU. It has involved the computer to process that message, even if only at an OS level. That should say bandwidth is not wasted on 3 links. Sorry, it's right. 3, but also in this example, there's 3 computers that do not want to receive that message. But if, as we've set this message as broadcast, they will receive the message and it will get passed all the way up to the OS to decide whether this message is important. So it's wasted time on the computer, albeit minusculely, and it's wasted bandwidth on their network links because they didn't need the data. However, in this example, all the trunks between the switches have only 1 copy of the data. We're not duplicating as we did with unicast here. And the sender only has to send 1 copy. So in this example, the sender does less work, but the switches have to do more work because they have to duplicate the message to every port that on the same VLAN. So there's this thing called switch capacity, which is how much processing power the switch has left, and it ends up using more capacity there. In reality, certainly in our world, this isn't a problem with enterprise level switches, but it's a thing that happens. So then we have multicast on an unmanaged network. So by unmanaged, I'm also including a managed network where we don't have multicast control turned on, which is called IGMP. We'll come to it in a moment. So now what happens in this example? Well, it looks an awful lot like what happens in broadcast. But the main difference is that within each device, it's the network interface that rejects any multicast messages it's not interested in, and not the CPU or the OS. So it doesn't actually take up software time on the computer. So how does multicast work? Well, there's a special, so we've talked about different ranges of IP addresses that are reserved for different things. And there's a whole load of addresses reserved for multicast addresses, 224.0.0.0 all the way through 239.255.255.255. If a switch on a LAN receives a multicast message, it will forward it to all devices in unmanaged mode. If we're not managing, so it's either an unmanaged switch or if the switch is not doing IGMP filtering, which we'll come to in a second. The network interface hardware on each device decides whether the software wants the data, but what's actually happened is when you run a program that says, I want a particular multicast stream of messages, the software tells its network interface which multicast message it's interested in, which is chosen by the address. So it means that the network interface, the hardware, is rejecting messages you do not need. In the same example as this, the sender only sends one copy, so the bandwidth there is only one. All the trunk links only have one copy. We are using bandwidth up on each leg to each computer, so it's basically like broadcast. Now, the last version of multicast is when we're running it on managed networks with this magical thing called IGMP, which is a control of multicast messages. Now, this example looks like we've got the benefits of unicast and broadcast, the best bits from each, which is ultimately what it is. So the sender still only has to send it once. It uses the multicast address ranges. Software on each computer tells their own network device which multicast addresses they're interested in. But one switch on the network acts as a querier and discovers which devices want which multicast messages. And then the switches only send the particular multicast messages to devices that want it. So this now saves us bandwidth on end links between computers that don't want it. So this looks like it's the best of both worlds. So it's good to think of multicast messages as like mailing lists. So if are most of you familiar with like group email mailing lists, certainly within an office environment? So you'll have your own email address in the company, and then there might be group email addresses, say all technical staff or all front of house staff or that. And if you send an email to that address, everyone who's in that group receives it. And that's a lot like how multicast messages work. You still have your individual addresses, but you register in group, you want to receive a group. And then somebody sending to that group, that message will get to you. As I sort of already said, with unmanaged networks, multicast messages are basically treated like broadcast messages and sent to each device. It's down to the software. What makes it different is the software tells the network interface which group address email it's interested in. We're sticking to our email analogy. A program might tell the network interface, I will obviously receive any messages intended directly to me and any messages for the group, all technical staff. And then it will pass into the computer. In broadcast messages, it has to get all the way through for the program to decide. On managed networks with this IGMP, which stands for Internet Group Management Policy, another great acronym, the software tells the as we've seen with multicast, the software tells the network interface that it's interested in a particular group address. One switch on the network, technically within the VLAN, acts as a querying device. And what it does is it periodically asks every network device within that VLAN, hey, what group messages are you interested in? And then, because the network interfaces on each device have been told by software running on that computer which group messages they're interested in, they can reply and say, yes, actually, I want messages from 224.0.0.1 and 238.da. And now this switch, the querying switch, knows which group address messages to forward to which devices. But that's only one switch that knows, and quite often messages have to traverse 3, 4, 5, 6 switches. So then what happens is the querier switch tells all the other switches on the network this same information. And at that point, they can work out which routes to send multicast messages if they're needed to be sent to computers. Sadly, being computers, we don't have nice group address names, and they're just numbers between 224.0.2, but they are the same thing. How are these numbers chosen? Well, I believe there's some can be registered with an international body to stop other people using the same number. But ultimately, it's down to the software programmers or Dante designers to decide which group addresses they're going to use, which numbers they're going to use with their products. And their software, their devices will register to receive messages from those group addresses. Bonjour, which is the discovery mechanism that Apple created, that enables devices to tell other devices what their name is against their IP address, uses a group address, and Bonjour uses 224.0.0.251, and that's registered. So on any device, any computer where they want to use Bonjour, that software will tell the network interface on that computer, I'm interested in all messages being sent to 224.0.0.251. Then when the querying network switch asks if it's on a managed network, hey, what are you interested in? It will say, oh, I want all group addresses from this address. A little aside at the bottom, I'm not going to discuss it. With all IP address messages, we have a port number as well, which isn't a socket on the device. This is that confusing thing. It's like the internal mailbox of the computer. So port 80 is where the port numbers are still used with multicast, but let's not worry about that for now. So why do we care about multicast messages? Well, Dante uses them for a couple of things. And most of the time with flows, we're using unicast, but you can select audio flows to be, some of them to be multicast. So that's one use that Dante does. Secondly, the whole audio clock mechanism of Dante uses multicast messages. And Dante uses Precision Time Protocol version 1, touched on last week, and that uses multicast address 224.0.1.129. If all Dante devices cannot see messages from that group address, they don't work. They have no audio clock. That's how they do the audio clocking. There's a couple other group addresses used for control and discovery as well, but let's not worry about that for a second. If we're not doing multicast Dante audio flows, then this is the only network multicast traffic. So it's actually not a lot of data, the clocking mechanism. It does go up the more and more devices you put on the network. So realistically, on most Dante networks, certainly the scale we're working at, if this Dante is within its own VLAN, then there really isn't much point in bothering to set up this filtering method. Just allow them to be broadcast to every device. Because if in that VLAN you only have Dante devices, then all those Dante devices want the same clock information, so there's no filtering anyway. So that's why on small Dante networks, unmanaged switches are just fine. We don't need to control the multicast messages, certainly if we're not doing multicast flows. However, as a Dante network grows, the number of clock messages squares, part of the math. And if you have IGMP filtering, then you can actually, only the right messages get to the right devices, so we can reduce some of our data loading parts of the network. However, the biggest reason you should ever really be thinking about using IGMP, and you really should, is if you're introducing multicast flows. Because chunks of sample data being repeated to every single device on your network is a lot of traffic. And it's better that it's stopped only decided, switch only send it to the devices that need it. So, excuse me a second. The first thing to be clear on is IGMP querying and filtering is a per VLAN process. So we've already sort of talked about on some of our shows, we might have 10 or so VLANs in use. You have to have a querying device, so one device that's doing the querying, and all devices doing filtering, and you have to configure this per VLAN. And you can enable or disable it per VLAN. More and more programs and architectures and in devices are using multicast messaging. So whilst we might not worry about it generally, I think it's something we need to be aware of. One example of where we definitely don't want multicast messages being broadcast, unless they have to go over the link, is over Wi-Fi. Because if we allow it to be treated like a broadcast message, we're using Wi-Fi bandwidth. So we definitely want to block all multicast messaging going to Wi-Fi. For sort of most reasons, I have only been enabling IGMP querying and filtering on my Dante VLANs. And I've been doing it on the main control VLANs, or what we call our control net, which is where all the amplifiers and VNC world lives. And that's also where our Wi-Fi access points live. So that's how I'm blocking any multicast messages going over Wi-Fi. Recently, I discovered that actually Adalink XDIPs, which are a KVM over IP solution, they pretty much require you to have IGMP turned on. So on any VLANs that I'm putting KVM over IP, I've also now been enabling IGMP. Honestly, it's best to leave it off on any other VLANs. Not all, although this is a well-defined system, not all devices behave properly. And if you start filtering messages just because the switch didn't understand a request to receive a message, then that device no longer works properly. And I'm not talking Dante, I'm talking generally. So truthfully, it should be something only turned on if you actually need it. So IGMP querying, how does it work? Well, within each VLAN, only one switch can be set as the querier. So this is a switch that will then poll every device on the VLAN and say, hey, what group messages do you want? And then that querier is responsible for making sure all other switches know which group address message needs to be forwarded. And if we look at our very, very simple example, this querier will poll the network, say, hey, who wants this particular group address? And this device will both say, hey, yes, I do. And that will get back to this switch. And this switch will tell this switch that this device needs the information, as does this one. And it will then be made to propagate through the trunks automatically as required, because it can see it needs to get to that point. It's a pretty automatic process, which is helpful. But from a redundancy point of view, if only one switch is the querier, and then that switch were to fail, well, then suddenly we have nothing dealing with these requests, and we get back into the problem of messages being blocked for no reason, or being broadcast everywhere. Now, clever people have already thought of that, and actually choosing which device as a querier can be made an election process. And by that, I mean all devices can do it, but there is a method for them to be chosen. And actually, you can do this by each switch being given a priority number. And the way it works is the switch with the lowest priority number becomes the querier. Now, it would be quite boring to have to work out this priority number directly. This priority number on most switches, Cisco definitely, and other switches, looks like an IP address. And in actual fact, it can be the IP address. It's just a number, though. It's being used as a number, which is the smallest number. Whichever device has the smallest number becomes the query. But it is actually an IP address in format. It's 4 numbers, each 255. And what Cisco does is it will automatically, when you're configuring IGMP for a particular VLAN, will by default set the querier IP address of itself to the IP address of itself in that VLAN. Slightly confusing. So if the switch is 192.168.1.251 in VLAN 1, then if we were setting IGMP up on VLAN 1 on that switch, it would automatically use that address as in the query IP field if we leave it as default. That's very helpful, because then every switch will have a unique query IP address in that VLAN, because we set the switches to different IPs, and it will all just work automatically. It will choose one of the switches. However, this automatic setting of this parameter, and I got caught by this recently, doesn't work if the switch doesn't have an IP address in each VLAN. Now, we didn't really discuss this, but if you're doing inter-VLAN routing, we know that we've set our switches, in all the discussion we've done, we've set our switches with an IP address on the main VLAN network, VLAN 1. And we're using it as our management network, so that's how we configure the switch. If we were enabling messages to transfer between VLANs, which I strongly don't think we need to be doing, then you would need to give a switch a unique IP address within each VLAN. If you do that, then this automatic setting works. However, on, say, our Dante network, which might be VLAN 201 or 200 or whatever, mostly the switches will not have IP addresses in that range, in that VLAN. And so every switch will be defaults to 255.255.255.255, all the same as default. And what that means is the election process doesn't work. And at that point, this querying system fails, and you'll tend to see that on a Dante network. In Dante controller, it will suddenly look like every device has its own master clock. It will suddenly look like there's 8, 9, 10 master clocks on the network. because they can't see each other. They can't register for these group messages to do with the clock. And so they decide that they each have their own clock. So it's important that we make sure we set this variable if we're configuring this. So back to our good old switches. Dante and Adder. So decisions on what to use. I've talked about multicast addresses in an IP world. They do also exist in a MAC address world, but is not very, very common at all. So I'm not really going to discuss it. Both Dante and Adder XDips, and I think any other thing I've seen, all use IP group addresses, which we've been discussing. So addresses, group addresses of 224, etc. So we tell our Cisco switches that we only want to deal with IP group addresses. Then in our menus, we have multicast. So I didn't show you that they're multicast tab properties. Then we go into IP version 4, which is we're using version 4 of IP, 4 numbers. And we go into this thing called IGMP snooping. And snooping is the process of setting your query and listening to a switch that's not the query, listening to other switches to tell it which message is being sent where. We have to add an entry here for each VLAN. So in this particular device, I only had 2 VLANs set up, VLAN 1, VLAN 5. And as you can see, I've only enabled snooping on VLAN 1 and the query, and that's the query IP address that we've been talking about. It's not actually used as any kind of destination, it's just used as this priority. So we enable it globally, but then per VLAN we have to say yes or no. If when you click edit on one of these, this is where you can turn on and off. There's been some confusion looking at lots of forums lately about query aversion. Like all things, they write a protocol and then 2 years later they say, hey, we've made a better version of the protocol. There's 2 versions of this querying mechanism in existence, version 2 and version 3. The literature from Dante is confusing, but it's mainly down to if you're looking at forums at what date they were posted. Nowadays, Dante is compatible with both types of query message. However, most devices nowadays, certainly OSs on computers, are only compatible with version 3. So we should be using version 3. Because I stole this photo from somewhere else I haven't got correct, it should be version 3. And this is where we set this priority, how this decision is made. If you leave it in auto, if it has an IP address in that VLAN, it will set that automatically to that IP address. Everything is great. If you don't have, this switch doesn't have an IP address in that VLAN, that will sit at all 255s, or it might not show you any number. That's where there's a problem. So you would then have to click user defined. And because it is just a number, and the actual IP address doesn't, number you put in doesn't matter, in every VLAN on a given switch, I just use the switch's IP address. So then each switch will still be different. Then we move forward into VLAN settings. And we have to edit a few values. Query interval is how often does it ask devices what they want to do. These are the default settings that you should use with Dante, and it works fine with most other devices. That's the quickest we can make it do it, and that makes it the most responsive. By it querying more often, it will discover devices want a particular group quicker, therefore the device will start working quicker. We've briefly touched on the fact that you have one querying switch, but then all the other switches need to learn from that querying switch. They have to discover where that querying switch is. Now you can manually say which socket on the switch it would find the master querying switch, but that's not recommended, because if your topology changes or a switch fails and it changes, it won't automatically discover. Believe it or not, on Cisco, the category labeled none actually means auto. That should really be called auto. And that's where it will automatically find the switch that's the querier and work out what it should do. I found that quite confusing the first time I looked at it. There's another tab called unregistered multicast. and what to do. And basically, I think these names should be forward to all or block to all. Unregistered multicast is where a transmitter device doesn't tell the network correctly that it is going to send these group messages. There's an awful lot of devices out there that don't behave correctly. Logically, the default behavior for the switch should be just send that message to everything, because the switch can't work out what to do because it's not conforming with this protocol of saying registering whether something wants it or not. So your default behavior should just be, you know what, if you don't know who it's for, just send it to everyone. Because otherwise, if you block it, so on our closed networks, if you block it, then that will stop devices working, and it will take weeks to work out what's going on. So just forward anything that's unregistered. The final one is per port on your switch, you can set whether just to forward all multicast or not to that port. So you can override this registration rules. Now, in general, you would think, well, that's pointless. Why would I want to do this? Because the whole point is to filter bandwidth and not have messages going to computers that don't want it. However, there is a known problem with DVS on certain OSs and hardware combinations where the DVS software doesn't correctly tell the network card that it's interested in P2P messages, etc., etc. And therefore, the network switch won't be told it's interested in these clock messages, so therefore it won't send them. And you'll find that DVS just doesn't work, and it doesn't report this error very clearly. So the current advice from Ordinate is on any network switch on a port that's connected to a computer for DVS, you should set it to forward all static turned on, which basically disables the system on that port and it will receive all multicast messages. That is the current recommendation. As you can see, there's quite a lot of steps and things to be very specific on in doing it. I do go back to the unless you need to turn it on, don't turn it on. And in fact, on most Dante networks, if they're in their own VLAN, you don't need to enable this, certainly on the scale of Dante we're doing. And we tend not to, well, I don't think we use Dante multicast flows at all on our shows. However, I have noticed it make a little bit of an improvement if I turn it on our control networks for Wi-Fi. So I think we do have to consider it. So Dante uses multicast for a couple of things. We've looked at it from the clock point of view. How do we actually do these multicast flows? Well, I'll quickly look through this. Brooklyn 2 Dante card has 32 flows. We talked about that last week. Each flow can actually be unicast or multicast. Multicast with appropriate IGMP filtering will not overload a network. However, unless a channel of audio needs to be sent to more than 2 or 3 devices, unicast remains overall the more efficient method, and just stick to it. And that's why I say in our general world, we tend to only split things 1 to 2. So an example of out of the Avid console, RMIOs goes to 2, all the data goes to 2 DS100s, etc., etc. But if you really want to do it, if you open a particular device in Dante controller, so that's the DS100, up here is the magical multicast flow button. At that point, a window pops up and you add transmit channels of yours to this new multicast flow. So you're defining these channels exist together in the multicast flow. Brooklyn 2 and this Yamaha 128 by 128 card allow actually 8 channels of audio per flow instead of 4. So you can get more channels through it. If, however, this window will merrily let you go over 8, every block of 8 you use eats up another flow. And unlike unicast messages where it's only as you patch channels does it establish a unicast flow, when you configure a multicast flow, that flow is immediately in use, even if you have no devices that want to receive any of those channels. It will permanently be sending that data. If you set a channel to be in a multicast flow that is currently also patched in a unicast way, so it's got a couple of patches already established, then Dante Controller is pretty clever, and it cancels the registration on the unicast flows and sets the end device to now use this new multicast flow. So it automates the process very nicely. In my example, I chose the first 6 channels of this DS100 leaving to be a multicast flow. It's told me now that I've got a multicast flow. Great. Now, if I patch to any of those channels, so on the routing page, it will establish to this multicast flow. Looking at a device again, this is looking at the receiving device that I've patched channels from my DS100 to. I can see that these channels have been patched using multicast because it's got this 2 arrow, and these channels have been patched using unicast. You don't really have to worry too much. We don't tend to need to get to it, but it is good to see. That slide, the bottom bit of that text doesn't make sense. I will get rid of that. Moving on from that, one thing I didn't point out last week to do with this picture, there normally should be 2 ticks on a receive channel next to all the channels. That tick means that that device is currently receiving that channel happily over primary. If I had both networks configured, there should be another column of tick that says it's receiving that channel happily over secondary. And if you've got a problem with either network, that's another way you can fault find, because you might find that all the channels on secondary can't be connected, but it has got connection on primary. Unfortunately, I couldn't easily establish the 2 networks here, but that's another really good fault finding method. Just on redundancy, we've talked a lot about primary. The Dante has it already sorted. It has these 2 networks that should be completely independent and 2 different switches. In general, a network switch failing will mean every device connected to that switch loses communication. Kind of obvious. For control of amplifiers in the middle of a show, it doesn't really matter. Similarly for radio monitoring, hey, if we lost our Dante switch, you can still use the front panel to monitor audio. However, digital audio and digital comm kind of need to not fail at a single point of failure. Dante provides a very neat way, has the 2 networks. There are definitely colleagues of ours in the world that are quite happy to put primary and secondary into 2 different VLANs using the same switch in each location. I personally don't get that logic at all. Now, some people say, oh yes, but then I do a spanning tree configuration so that all switches can see round all routes. Well, if an individual switch fails, you've lost all the channels from any devices connected to that switch, even though everything else would be fine. So you've definitely lost those channels. And B, spanning tree, which is this thing where you can do a loop of cables. If any link fails, it will reconfigure and go the other direction around the network. Can take up to 20 seconds to recover on a topology change, pulling a cable out. Can take 20 seconds to re-establish data going the other way. That could be 20 seconds of no audio. So not only have you lost any audio Dante devices physically connected to the one switch that's failed, it could take up to 20 seconds to get your audio back throughout the whole system of what's left. Loss of Dante, one of the primary or secondary, any component, most of the time is entirely seamless. You won't even hear that it's changed. So me personally, I really do not get this philosophy of putting Dante primary and secondary into the same switch in different VLANs. It makes no sense to me. But it's quite common, certainly in our bigger brother industry. So people have asked over the weeks about what's the ideal topology of switches, and et cetera, et cetera. And actually, a few of us joined a call the other week to say, hey, what should our policy be? As we all know, Gareth loves standards and likes us to try and do the same in every way possible as many times as we can. But actually, what me, Andy, Matt, and a few others all talk about, we kind of can't do this. We kind of can't make a one rule suits all shows. I wish we could, because it would make it easier to help people that don't have as much knowledge about networks, because you could just say, this is how we're doing it. It's the same on any of our shows. The simplest method, and arguably the easiest to change any components, is actually to have 4 isolated networks within your show. And that's one network that's VLAN, and we have the different VLANs within that. So our control networks, so that's VNC, amplifier control, etc. Radio data, COM, any KVM over IPs in their own keyboard networks, or even the internet crossing our networks with their own VLAN. And that would be one isolated network. So switches in any location that you need to use data from that network. Then we'd have our Dante primary network, again, completely isolated on its own set of switches everywhere. Don't have to do VLANs at that point if it's the only data on that particular brilliant network. You'd have to repeat that for secondary. And as most of you know on our shows, we tend to do our radio monitoring on a completely owned Dante network, but that's self-contained to just the radio rack. It's one switch keeping all the receivers together into the radio computer. If we were doing this topology and this method, both Dante primary and secondary switches in some locations could be unmanaged as long as they're not EEE. It's energy efficient mode that stops Dante from working properly. Only Dante switches routing many audio channels should be managed. This can result in, but this method can result in 3 switches in a few key locations: front of house, substage, and maybe also band racks and radio racks. This isn't necessarily the most elegant solution, but it does mean we have much fewer varieties of network switch configurations. And it might be possible for us to leave a switch on site for each configuration needed. To show that pictorially, this is what I'm talking about. So at front of house, we would have 3 switches. One which is to show VLAN, all the different VLAN. One switch only for Dante primary, one switch only for Dante secondary. 3 cables or fibers to the substage. In the substage, we'd repeat that. And then maybe in our remote amp room, we might need to repeat that. But band rack might only need show VLAN if we're not doing Dante to any of our band stuff. And the radio room would have 1 switch on the show VLAN, so it could get all the control data and radio data. And it would have just 1 switch for all the radio room Dante. And this is the simplest method. In actual fact, is what we did on most of the shows in the early days. And certainly it's a good topology if you need a lot of sockets on switches in lots of locations. It makes a lot of sense. It does use more switches and it does eat more rack space. This, I think, is accurate certainly to how Comfort London and Starlight are implemented. But truthfully, many of the decisions are based on many factors. How much rack space do we have? How big is front of house? Can we really waste 8U for network switches? How distributed is the equipment on this show? How many amp rack locations? Are we doing digital comm and KVMs? What switches do we end up getting from the rental shop? You know, we might expect Luminex, but we get Cisco. We might have wanted vice versa. If we have Luminex switches, most of them tend to only have 12 ports. Well, then this topology makes sense because we often don't require 28 ports of Dante in one location, which is the standard Cisco switch number of ports, only 12. But then it might be silly if we get substituted for a 28 port Cisco switch, then suddenly we only need 8 ports on it. It's a lot of space for no reason. The one rule I think we have to stick to is definitely don't combine Dante networks onto one switch. We've already said that enough times. This is a topology I've done recently, and I'm sure many others have, where I'm on one switch, one network of wiring. I'm doing Dante primary and all the other VLANs. And then on the other network, it's just Dante secondary. But I've had a few, in our discussion the other week, we had some ideas that actually maybe the better way is to make this network Dante primary plus all the other VLANs. And to make this network Dante secondary plus all the other VLANs. Why does that make sense? So that's just, I'm going to rush through this, but it's in the slides if people want. The idea is, if we go to this picture, it might make sense. So there's 2 switches at front of house. And the top one is actually is dealing with Dante secondary. And then it has all the other VLANs we might need at front of house. So ShowNet for QLab 1, QLab 2, all the networks for System 1, so we can configure COM and radio traffic, desk, and then we've got COM network broken out for our Helix comms panel, and a couple of ports broken out for some KVM IPs. If we duplicate that layout, QLab 1 control network, we can only plug one in once. But I've duplicated a socket available for it on this switch. And any ports on this switch that were set for secondary, on this switch are set for primary. So the logic being, if this switch, top switch lost power, Dante would be fine, because all those Dante devices would be running on the other network automatically, because they can be plugged into both. But you could then quickly take that cable from QLab 1 and plug it into here. Take that cable from QLab 2, plug it into here. Take this Helix comms panel, plug it into here. They have an alternative method for getting to the rest of the network. This takes a bit of thinking, and I've written it out in the slides. But this is just one idea that maybe we can move forward doing. Just to be clear, we haven't done this yet. And it also involves some other thought. Another thought as part of that process is a subtle one, and rush through it. But each COM master station actually has 2 network ports. They're the same network. So you could actually plug, so in our central location, plug that master device, one leg into this switch and one leg into this switch. And that would mean COM is then automatically on all switches, no matter what switch fails. You would just have to cross-plug locally to the alternate switch if a network went down. To make this work, those that have thought this fully through, you'd have to link all of the VLANs between the 2 networks at some point at one location. And if you did that here, you would link all of the VLANs, but if you were trying this topology, which we think makes the most sense, you would not link the COM network across them, because otherwise you're creating a circle. And you would definitely not link the 2 Dante networks. To be clear, this is not something we've done, but it's something we might do in the future. That's just blahs. I'm not going to talk about it much now. It's all in the slides, which we'll send out. But there's one other area that you can, there's many other things you can do with a network switch. But you can set rules on filtering messages onto different sockets. So you can say filter any messages with a destination port address of this, or a destination IP of this, or from sender this. Why would we want to do that? And truthfully, in our world, we mostly don't want to do it. An enterprise, big network level, they often put filtering in for security reasons, or if they're dealing with legacy equipment that can't handle certain messages that the network might be sending, they want to make sure they absolutely can't get to them. An example Scott brought up in the first week, if we send a ping message out, so ping is a way of discovering, checking a device is on a network, you send a ping, it replies and says, yes, I'm here. Those of us that have done this in the past, TC6000 reverb engine, if you send a ping message to it, crashes its network interface, so it will no longer talk on the network until you reboot it. That's a software bug. It shouldn't do that. But that is a fault with this device. So sometimes we have to do network filtering to make sure an end device doesn't behave oddly due to a software bug to a particular message it's received either through broadcast or another device being configured badly and sending messages to it that it shouldn't. Truthfully, we're not really concerned for the security reason in our world. All our Wi-Fi connections we secure using MAC address filtering. We're not too worried about bandwidth. We've got either fiber nowadays on our trunks. We've got all these other systems in place. But we do sometimes have to think about protecting devices that misbehave badly. You can configure these rules in any managed switch. But once we start doing that, one thing that I've always tried to do is any of these VLAN 1 sockets labeled one new ShowNet, one untagged ShowNet, are all identical. And that would mean I could plug QLab 1 into here, I could plug it into here, or here, or here. These are all on the same VLAN. Anything in now red on this drawing. If we now start adding filtering rules to particular sockets, then now suddenly that socket is not the same as that socket. So it's something I don't want to do unless we have to do it. Honestly, we've only had to start doing it for trying to protect the Avid. In theory, the ECX port on an Avid should not in any way interfere with the AVB network on an Avid. However, geniuses at Avid are reasonably certain that that is what occurred on a couple of occasions, some of our shows. Sorry, Joe Green. Inside the physical surface, there's a computer motherboard, has two network interfaces, and internally one of those physically connects to the ECX socket on the back of the desk, and one of those connects internally to the AVB network. Because we've had a couple of problems in the past, we are now recommending that we filter all network traffic to the ECX port on Avid. In reality, on our shows, we only use the ECX connection for VNC access. And we could use them for the Avid remote app for all dream mixes, but lately we don't tend to do that in our workflow. Up until very recently, we were also using it to get flux analyzer audio data out of the desk, but nowadays we're putting sound cards on those computers and doing it analog. I should at this point be incredibly fair to say that it's not just Avid. There's so much hardware in the world that through issues somewhere get upset by certain network messages arriving at their door for a very long time, and I still believe it's true. If anything else shares the same VLAN as a Digico, so Digico components talking to each other to the expander surface or linking the two engines together in an S7. In fairness to them, if any other device existed on that network for years, potentially could cause the two surfaces to behave incredibly badly. And Digico, I mean, I think beyond strongly recommend it you keep all of the Digico component network, control network, isolated from all other network traffic. And they vehemently stand by that. So in fairness to having made this sound like an Avid thing, in fairness, it exists for other companies as well. And it's actually arguably Avid is plays much more nicely because Digico bans everything else. In theory, we can put remote control apps and all kinds of things with Avid. Now, there's one world where we could just give the Avid its own VLAN and its own Wi-Fi, and that in theory sounds great. But Gareth, myself, and others who adjust stuff during production periods and shows, we want to sit with one tablet in the auditorium that we can connect to our system computer in R1 and log into the console and log into QLAN. So for our workflow, that doesn't work particularly well to isolate it entirely. So the solution is very simple. We filter all network traffic on the network switch that connects, on the port of the network switch that connects to the Avid ECX port, and only allow messages to involve with VNC. Now, VNC is a very simple protocol, and it sends its messages using the VNC server wants to receive requests from the clients only on one port number, this internal mailbox, which is port number 5900. So actually, it's very trivial. We can set a rule on the switches to block any messages to the Avid unless they are destined for port 5900. And that's as simple as that. I have worked through those steps, but I appreciate I'm very near the end of the time. But there are steps in here of how you set that rule up. One thing to say is you have to do one for UDP, which is a type of message protocol. And you have to do one for TCP, both on port 5900. And you can filter by IP address as well, but we don't want to. We want any device that's trying to talk to the Avid on port 5900 to be allowed. And we want to permit that rule. And then when you apply that rule to a physical socket, unless it matches that rule, we deny all the other data. So it's saying only allow data on port 5900, UDP or TCP. everything else is blocked. And it's a very simple solution. Someone mentioned last week, oh, would that stop VenueLink working between the Avid and Pro Tools? But all the VenueLink data, so that's when you create a new session in Pro Tools, the pulling of the channel strips and the marker later as you recall snapshots, is actually sent over the AVBC port. So you don't need that connection. And as we said last week, you probably shouldn't be connected to the Pro Tools computer. So wrapping up 5 sessions of lots of nonsense. For most people on here, truthfully, don't worry if you're not going to remember most of this. You really don't need, the point of this was not to make you all into boring network gurus. The main aim of what I wanted to achieve was put a couple of ideas out there. No one's expecting people to fault find everything on their own. But if you know a little bit about it, then if tech support or myself or Matt or Andy or Dom or Josh are trying to support you, it means you've got a slightly better idea of what we're asking you to do when we say go to this thing, go to that thing. It's about giving you an idea of stuff. I've done these little helper sections of how to replace, but truthfully, again, not expecting me, Gareth, no one is expecting suddenly all of you to be able to change everything out on your own without support. The rules are the same. If you need support, ask for support. It's absolutely fine. If you do want to do further reading or anything I haven't quite explained very well, both Yamaha and Shure websites have excellent documentation on network configurations to do with audio networks. They're quite similar in the information that I've said, but they are very good things. And the last thing I want to say, which is a slightly negative thing, is for the more technically nerdy on this group. I really do want to encourage people to be curious. I do want people to go and look at how shows are set up and learn and explore. But I really, on running shows, I urge caution. In a managed switch, changing a single setting can result in the whole network suddenly not behaving correctly. And indeed, you then being locked out of the switch to be able to put back the thing you just ticked. I know that because I've done it. And I really do want to encourage the technically minded to be curious. Go have a look. Go log into some things. Go see what's happening. I would encourage it. Just be careful. Don't change stuff accidentally, because that's harder to support. And I will post this up later today. That's wrapping up what I planned to do